This evening's program is about photography's impact on journalism and journalism's coverage of war. We've titled it, The Impact of Images on War, How It Has Changed Since Vietnam. The Associated Press has long been recognized for providing the definitive coverage of the Vietnam War. Over the period of the war, AP won 6 Pulitzer Prizes for its coverage, for both stories and breaking news photography. Some of the greatest names in war correspondence staffed the AP Bureau. Horst Foss, Malcolm Brown, Peter Arnett, Nick Ut, George Esper, Eddie Adams, to name a few. AP's photo coverage from the Vietnam War constitutes the largest and most comprehensive collection of photography from the war, more than 25,000 images. With the 50th anniversary of the war coming up, AP put together the first ever collection of these images to tell the history of the combat and the conflict in Vietnam. The book, Vietnam, the Real War, A Photographic History by the Associated Press, is a collection of 300 of those images. The foreword is by famed New York journalist Pete Hamill, who also spent time as a reporter in Vietnam. Some of the images of the book are so iconic, they are instantly recognizable. The burning monk, the napalm girl, the homecoming, the wounded medic. 4 AP staffers were killed during the war. All were photographers. I have a question. Did these images, as well as those from other remarkable photographers who covered the war from other agencies, change the way Americans viewed the war in Vietnam? Now, to get us going before the discussion, we're going to have a slideshow of some of the images from the book. If we could bring the lights down, thank you.
I have a question I want to ask the audience when I start. Just raise your hand if you were served in Vietnam. Okay. So this is a very personal evening, and these are all journalists who have covered war. I guess an obvious question is, why does someone want to cover a war? So one thing I do want to remind before I get someone to answer that question is you will get cards, and if you have questions, I guess they'll be brought up to me. But Peter, you went to Vietnam as a very young man. Why did you want to go to Vietnam as a journalist?
Yeah, very young man, but something to remember. I was 26 years of age, and most of my colleagues, all of them at that time, Halberstam, Sheehan, were approximately the same age. But it turned out that we were much older than the vast majority of the American troops who eventually went into Vietnam. And in addition, we had all had a couple of years military experience because of the draft system. So we sort of knew knew military. We could get along with military pretty well. So when the AP suggested I go to Vietnam, I had visited earlier in the late 50s. And it seemed to me that it was definitely a doable assignment, because many of the American advisors that were there when I got there in '62, we knew that they were 10 or 12,000, roughly our age. And I figured it was probably a story that I could cover well. And the Associated Press, you don't turn down their assignments very often. And I said, yes, sir, confident that it would be a significant story.
So, Mike, you were in Vietnam in the service. What did you think of the journalists when they were around you?
We didn't see much of them. In fact, the only one I could remember too was Ed Bradley from CBS hanging outside the gate of the Da Nang Air Base trying to get in. And then, but I remember one photographer, Larry Burroughs, who was a very tall, gangling man. And we were at a reconnaissance base, and he was requesting to go out with one of the patrols, and everyone looked at him and immediately said, there's no way we're taking this guy out in the field. He had all these cameras hanging all over him, whatever. And at that, he just started jumping up and down, and he had painstakingly taped every piece of equipment that he had so it made no sound whatsoever. And he impressed the room of Marine officers right away, saying, this guy knows what he's doing. And Peter, you made the comment about you guys really had more experience than most of the military people. Some of the guys who went out in that patrol with Burroughs came back and told me they thought he knew more about tactics and military and being in the field than they did out there. So I never really saw up in Da Nang, I must say, I never really saw that many of them. It was just Ed Bradley and Larry Burroughs.
Yeah, it was a very different time. I mean, the U.S. Military didn't really bring journalists everywhere, but you really hitched rides. And Santiago and Julie obviously did not cover Vietnam, but I would like to ask both of them especially as photographers, when you were growing up and seeing those images, how they influenced you in terms of what you thought you might want to do, not only as a journalist, but in terms of a career choice, if that was something that influenced you. Santiago?
Yeah, I started in journalism fairly young, at the age of 17, translating news stories from Spanish into English at that time surrounding the conflict in Central America, the civil war in El Salvador and the conflict in Nicaragua. And I was reading all of these dramatic stories of ambushes and massacres and things like that. And I determined that I had to see that stuff with my own eyes and filter it and tell those stories. And somebody said, well, if you want to see that stuff up close, you should become a photographer. So I bought a camera and set about training myself and being trained on how to be a photographer. And some years later, I actually made it to Central America at the age of 23. And as part of that preparation and education into the craft of photography, I was very heavily influenced by a lot of these pictures that we've just seen and many others from other conflicts. And it sort of became a dynamic where you wanted to emulate that work, but do it yourself and put your own stamp and vision on it. And over the years, I got sort of caught up into that dynamic and spent a good 10 years covering wars and probably a war a year until finally my glass was full and I decided to move on to other things and reinvented myself into this role.
Julie, what influenced you
when I had a little bit more formal training in journalism. I went to J school at the University of Kansas, and when I was my senior year, that's when the first Gulf War broke out. And of course, all as students, you know, we'd been just studying, already looking at all the photos from Vietnam and even some from World War II. So there's already that influence, and of course, you're young and impressionable. Just like Santi said, you want to go out and do some of those things yourself. But some of the images, a lot of the images we were seeing from the Gulf War in '91, they were press conferences or tours because there was no embed process yet. It was very limited at that time. So when I joined the AP in 2001, this was, I'd been at a newspaper for 10 years already, and I suddenly had the opportunity to go and cover a war, and they said there's going to be an embed process. You're going to be, you know, tip of the spear. It was like, wow, I'm actually gonna get to see things and do what we wanted to do 10 years ago, but nobody else had really access to at that point. It was sort of like, you know, revisiting what Nick Ut had done and some of these guys who covered Vietnam. At that point, we realized, you know, it wasn't gonna be open access to everything, but it was a step in the right direction. And of course, being what I think I was like 30 years old at the time, you know, whenever you're young like that and you want to, there's a big story, you want to go out and do it. And that was the story of the day or the year for the last 10 years now. So yeah, that definitely all the pictures that we've seen up here, that was the biggest influence. You know, you want to go out and make your own and put your own impression on it.
Peter, can you talk a little bit about what it was like to actually, what it took to get in the field, what it took to file? I mean, now we're in the age of technology, and if you can talk a little bit about what it actually took to go out and cover a story, and then how would you get the type of impact you could really feel from a story after you actually literally might go out in the field and risk your life to get a story?
Give me 2 minutes to respond.
No, I mean, I know you can go on.
No. Well, I love to quote the instruction manual that I received when I entered the AP Bureau in June 28, 1962. I arrived the same day as Horst Voss. I'd come in from Singapore, he'd come in from Laos, and Malcolm Brown was the bureau chief, and Malcolm was a tall, fair-haired, also an AP fair-haired guy, because Wes Gallagher, the president of the AP, really admired Mal. But Mal had several years' experience in the US military, so he gave us an instruction manual, and I want to quote from it quickly. He wrote, "The whole idea of covering a military action is to get the news and pictures back and not to play soldier yourself. You should know how to swim, canals and ditches are often above your head, lie prone under fire and move only on your belly, look for cover and move toward it. Other advice, when moving with troops, avoid staying close to the head of a column or the point man in a formation. Professional soldiers are paid to do this." And he says, "Do not stand or march close to a radio man or medic because they are prime targets of the enemy." And an additional point he made, he said, "Stick close to the commander who is generally in the safest position available." But he did add, "You'll learn more from him than most of the others anyway." So we had that advice. Now, we're all aware, I'm sure, that Vietnam was the most open war for journalists in modern history. In fact, you have to go back to, I guess, to the American Civil War, when you had the kind of pictures that you see in this great AP book, close-ups of the faces of dead young American soldiers. You have to go back to Matthew Brady in the Civil War, I think, to get similar images. But it was that tradition that guided all the photographers, that Larry Burroughs that Mike mentioned, and Horst Voss and the others that came to Vietnam. They were also really respectful of Robert Capa, who had been killed a decade earlier in Vietnam. And they often quoted Capa's advice, if the pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. Does anyone on AP ever say that to you? if the pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. So there was a degree of bravery plus experience that led to the pictures that have emerged in the book. One other point, we were reliant constantly on our Vietnamese staff in Vietnam. Nick and Phan Dan Phuc, essential for us to get pictures that were not easy for us to get with Vietnamese troops. Their bravery, total commitment to work for the AP and bring pictures back was unbelievable. Both were wounded, and Phan Dan Phuc lost an eye, but they continued to cover. So there was a combination of these factors, our experience, the tradition of photography and coverage, and the availability of local people willing to share our dream of coverage that made our work possible and made our AP book
So,
possible.
Peter, when you went out, I know you carried a camera and you probably had a notebook and a pencil and maybe a pen, but you didn't want a pen would get wet and you couldn't write in the rain with a pen. But did you make it a habit of going out with either Horst or other photographers from the Bureau? And if you did, why? Not just obviously the picture, but was there a reason to go out and work with a photographer in Vietnam?
Say that quickly again for me. I'm 79 years old yesterday.
No, can you describe, a day when you would go out and why you chose, or did you choose to work and make sure you're always with a photographer? And why was that important in terms of how you went out and reported a story? And just describe how you would file a story a little bit and, your day, and in terms of the differences today with the technology, what it was like to actually write and report and file from Vietnam.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I get your question, but I want to read that. In the meantime, I'm going to read you this message that Horst wrote.
He's very scripted sometimes. Go ahead.
If you want to see what was relatively routine for photographers in Vietnam, and I mean, Nick Ut or Phan Dan Phuc, Larry Burroughs, many other photographers could have written this memo. This was a message to New York, commenting on pictures that Horst had got on Operation Hastings, a Marine operation in 1966. And he'd come back with pictures, and he sent off a half a dozen pictures, radio photo over the telephone to New York, and sent just a message of what it was all about. He said, quote, "I rode into Operation Hastings on helicopters with a battalion force of Marines. I was in the 4th helicopter to fly in, and I was lucky. Helicopters 5, 6, and 7 crashed coming in, all shot down by North Vietnamese gunfire from the nearby hills that ranged around us. Debris from the disintegrating helicopters wounded Marines around me, and wildly flailing rotor blades mangled several in front of me. Within 2 minutes of landing, I had exposed 4 rolls of film. After the confusion and horrors of the helicopter crashes, I retreated to the old shallow Viet Cong foxholes dug around the landing zone. All day there was grazing fire from the North Vietnamese and mortar rounds coming in. But it was easy for me because I did not have to walk at all to get my photos. We were all pinned down." And he ends the message by saying, "Late in the evening, an enemy machine gunner began firing at a formation of Marine helicopters flying to bring reinforcements in. Tracer bullets entered the belly of one helicopter, setting it afire. I just followed the smoke trail with my 200-millimeter lens as it was heading for my position. The helicopter appeared ready to crash right on top of us. After taking 2 pictures with my 35-millimeter lens from below the burning ship, I dashed to a foxhole for safety as it crashed 50 meters away." And actually 3 or 4 of the pictures are in the book. Now, Horst's luck didn't last. He was seriously wounded late in '67, but that was the routine of many combat photographers. And why did Horst do it? Why did the others do it? They believed that an accurate picture of what was happening to the Americans and the Vietnamese was what was required. They were governed by that.
Thank you. Mike, when you were in the service, what did that teach you about becoming a journalist, or why, how did that all come about?
Well, it really kind of came full circle when I was embedded in Iraq, because having been a participant in Vietnam, I really wanted to go to Iraq to kind of bear witness. I first didn't think we'd ever get into another war under kind of dubious circumstances again, and found myself sitting in the desert in Kuwait telling my wife and my cameraman's wife that we'll never go in. You know, we're from the Vietnam era, this is not going to happen again, and sure enough, we went in. So I think the military, I really wanted to go as a reporter to see what the military was like now some 35, 40 years later. And so my military background, and I once met Eddie Adams, the photographer, who had been a former Marine himself, and he told me about how he and David Douglas Duncan, who was also a Marine in World War II, really used their military experience to try to add another dimension to the story. And I think it did help me understand a little bit more better than maybe some of my colleagues what was going on a military basis. But I think having been in one war, I felt compelled to bear witness to the next war that I had a chance to go into, and that was Iraq.
Okay. We're going to show, if you're ready, another set of slides, because a lot of the questions I'm getting for the audience really sort of bring it up to date and issues around the media. I think it would probably be useful if then we can show these slides and then we'll continue the conversation. Okay? So, Julie, can you, one of the things Peter said is in Vietnam you really could move around. You had access. In the wars you've covered, you were mainly embedded. And how did that differentiate what you could do? Did you feel restricted? And I'd also like you to address a little bit, just as a woman photographer, and there are many more now than there were during Vietnam, what opportunities that created for you and also obstacles.
I didn't really feel limited in an embed, and we had this discussion last night at dinner. A lot of it had to do with the field commander, what they felt comfortable with you doing, and for the most part, initially in the beginning, and being a female, I think was part of it. There was some apprehension about having me go out on patrols or missions, but as soon as I got out there, and I always just needed one day to be out there with them. After that, it was clear I wasn't going to be a liability to them, as far as, having to carry my gear or me needing to go back to the outpost. I was good to go after that. I could do anything I wanted. No one ever looked over my shoulder to see what I had shot. Nobody ever questioned anything. And like I said, as far as being a female goes, it was just, even the quarters that we stayed in. Sometimes they'd have me stay in the same quarters as the men, and sometimes they'd separate us out, and those were just, the rules that they felt like they needed to follow. But, like the assault in Afghanistan on Dahaneh, where eventually Joshua Bernard was killed, the initial assault, there were 3 of us women that wanted to go on that, and it was with the Marines, and this is an observation, not a criticism, but Marines were not quite as integrated as the Army was. So it seemed to me that they just didn't quite know what to do with us. And we really had to kind of really push to go on that assault, and eventually they relented and they allowed us to go with them. And I think it was it was on the second day where we went on house-to-house clearance, and it was 117 degrees that day. And I was with them for 8 hours and didn't complain. Every time we sat down and the platoon leader said, okay, we got to get going, I made sure I was the first one up. Didn't matter how tired I was, just made sure that I was always on my feet and ready to go. And at the end of the day, the squad leader, who initially I could tell didn't want me on his patrol, when we got back to the outpost, he came over to me and he said, Miss Jacobson, thank you for coming with us. We really appreciate it. You were a good trooper today. And after that, they were inviting me to go on patrol with them. I never had to ask again. So that was an example of what my axis became like. And like I said, a lot of it was the field commander. That particular company commander, he was very progressive. He actually told me, this was just a few months ago in an email, that he had gotten in trouble several times for being a little too open with the media. He felt it was important for people to see what they were doing out there and how things were. But I've been with the Army, and I've had the same experiences with them, where initially they don't want me out there, and they won't make any effort to help me get on their missions with them, and I have to find my own way on. But once I do, they'll come up to me later and say, we did that 8-mile patrol yesterday, and my guys were dropping like flies, but you kept going. And then they come and they get me whenever they want to go out. So it's really just a matter of proving yourself and staying with them. Again, he was open to everything. Never asked me not to shoot anything. I think when you get to the upper brass, they're a little bit more concerned about what you photograph and what you show. But it's how enlightened a person is out there as far as what your axis is going to be.
Julie, so let me just quickly follow up. Was there any censorship? Were you ever told you can't take a picture? Don't send that picture. You can't go here. What were the rules? Were there any rules? Did you get stopped?
There were formal rules within media ground rules, as far as as far as casualties go. You can't. You're not supposed to photograph a casualty in such a way that they're recognizable. But outside of that, no, there was really no. There was nothing that limited my access. If there was a place that was off limits on the base, it wasn't just off limits to me, it was off limits to a whole bunch of people. And that included other soldiers, other Marines. It was like a top secret area. But I think every once in a while you'd have a soldier or a Marine come up to you and say, hey, you took a picture of me doing this the other day, can you make sure not to publish it because I wasn't wearing this properly, I wasn't doing that right. And you know, as a journalist, you kind of self-censor, you think about things, you balance it out. Well, how costly is it if I go ahead and I release it? Or, you know, am I going to compromise photojournalism or journalism? Do people really need to see this? Or is there another picture that I have that tells the same story? I don't want this guy to get busted down just because he had his sleeves rolled up, you know? So those are just things that I think about. And that was the extent of the censorship.
Okay. One of my challenges tonight is you could probably listen to each one of these incredible people without anybody else here. So if any of you want to jump in, please do. But Santiago, you've covered many wars. You talked about as a young man. You now, and one of the things we talked about earlier, and I understand this, you now send people to war, not for political or military reasons, but what are some of the factors that go into your choosing and getting somebody to go to war, and what did you learn about your own experience that informs sending other photographers now to cover conflicts around the world?
Well, the first thing that's very important to note is that we do this purely on a volunteer basis. So we ask around and we talk to people who we think have sufficient experience in covering conflict, or who you know, have the right attitude or the right aptitude for these sorts of jobs, and we inquire with them whether or not they're interested in going to these assignments. And usually they want to, but not always. And when they don't want to, we don't pressure them. And if during an assignment they find that they're uncomfortable, or that the equation has somehow changed and they want to leave the assignment for their own reasons, we respect that and we pull people off of assignments. But generally we're looking for people who are psychologically prepared and physically prepared to take the sort of risks that covering combat or conflict entails. And so when we find those people and we put them into the theater of battle or conflict, whatever it might be, it's very important to have a dialogue with those people to understand what they're seeing, what they want to do, what aspects of the story we think are important. And so we try and guide the coverage from afar, also understanding that we can't micromanage the coverage from afar. So there's a dialogue of trust that builds up with the photographers on assignment or with the journalists on assignment, where we're giving them the perspective from afar, but also respecting their perspective on the ground.
So do you look, let me interrupt, in terms of the skills, I mean, you said you look for volunteers, but is there something that makes a war photographer or their coverage or what they see distinctive from going out and, say, covering a crime in the city or any other thing else? Do you look for that skill, or what are you looking for that makes really great war photography?
Well, we're looking for people who can, I guess, fulfill two basic requirements. Number one, they have to be talented photojournalists in the sense that they can tell a story effectively with their camera in an interesting and creative way. And the other thing, perhaps more importantly, is that they have the ability to maintain their concentration under very dramatic circumstances. And so people talk a lot about courage and a lot about bravery. In my experience, those are other words for concentration and focus. People who can keep their heads together, can control their emotions, can dominate their fear, and can go to the task at hand and successfully make the pictures and then leave the story. And what we found over the years, and I think this is a recurring issue, is that you come to rely on a certain group of people who can do that, but typically you can rely on them for a defined amount of time, because war photography, not unlike soldiering perhaps, is a young person's game in terms of the energy and the willingness to take calculated risks. And what we found fairly recently, I would say a couple of years ago, was that a whole generation of photographers that we had been relying on for the previous 10 or 15 years, for whatever reasons, were all coming to the end of their ability to do those stories. They were settling down, maybe having families, maybe they'd seen enough, maybe their glass was full, whatever the cases might be on an individual basis. And so we had to start making a conscious effort to identify and recruit and train the next generation. And initially, I found that sort of disturbing. I had not had to do that before. But it quickly became clear that we were dealing with people who were willing and able to go do that kind of work in the same way that the military encounters people who are willing and able to do that kind of work. So it was a sort of a logical refreshment of the pool of people who we would send to those stories.
And the other thing the audience should realize, obviously, is these people are all probably adrenaline junkies and took tremendous risks. And it's both terrifying at times, I'm sure, and exciting. But I wanted, here's a question which, Peter, I'll throw at you, and Mike, and please also, if you just want to engage in a conversation and want to follow up, just jump in. But this is from someone in the audience, and he said, I was in Vietnam in late 1962 and 1963, and again in 1966. The war proved unpopular. Were you influenced by your beliefs or philosophies and the tone of the public to photograph or report that, pro-war or anti-war sentiments at all?
Yeah, beliefs and attitudes. Well, my whole career was based on the belief that being a journalist, and particularly being a war correspondent, was an essential part of our democratic way of life. I'm not saying it now. I believe that. And I think the reporters who were there early in Vietnam also understood that telling the story of where young Americans were in action, or where American policy was being implemented, where the costs were increasingly higher, it was significant to tell that story for the folks back home, and for the families, and for government officials to look at our spin on what was going on. It wasn't spin, what we were discovering. I think it's important to remember that on one side you have the photographs and their drama that we see in the AP book. But we, as the writers, I was the reporter, we interpreted those pictures and the stories that went along with the pictures. The pictures actually were part of the stories we were writing. So we interpreted that picture basically for an audience. And I just want to share with you here an example of the unhappiness and bitterness that President Lyndon Johnson felt about the media and the image. Now, he was less concerned, it's clear from interviews we've had, and that the images were less significant than it was the conclusions that the journalists were reaching about his war effort. Now, I have an interview here that my daughter Elsa had with a man, Barry Zorthian, who was what we called the press czar in Vietnam from 64 to 68. He was sent to Vietnam to sort of shape up the American media. It was not easy for him. But he talked about his relationship. This is one example. He said he met at the White House in late 66, called there by Bill Moyers, who was then an assistant to LBJ. And they had a lunch meeting, so afterwards, he was asked to go up to visit LBJ. And he said, as he used to do periodically, LBJ was in bed in his bedroom, not a huge room. We went in. When he saw us there, he barely said hello. I'm not sure he said hello. He started taking off on the press. My daughter said, what was he concerned about? Chewing us out. Quote, God damn it, why can't you handle that press out there better? Why do you let them write that stuff? Why don't you straighten them out? Etc., etc. He was not really looking for an answer, Zorthian said, just wanting to get his frustration and annoyance about the press off his chest. And we were the best target. Bill Moyers had undoubtedly been through this so many times, he knew better than to try to answer or say anything beyond, yes, Mr. President. Zorthian said, I would occasionally try to get a word in and discovered quickly that it was better to just keep your mouth shut and sit there. But to end this, he said, the fascinating part of this, And I guess LBJ, again, this was typical of him because of others have gone through this kind of event. In the middle of his monologue, nonstop monologue, he threw off his bed covers, got out of bed, walked around, not missing one word. He still kept talking. Walked over to the John where the door was open. He left it open, relieved himself loudly, still talking. Came back, got into his bed, put the covers over him again, never stopped talking. And the talk was all about the press. Well, that's quite a sight for a not young but nevertheless fairly junior government official, Zorthian said. To sit there and watch the President of the United States walking over to the John. And my daughter said, did he question the loyalty of the press? Oh, sure, Zorthian said. Did he think they were communist-backed? My daughter said. Huh? Yes. He would just fulminate against them. He got so damn bad. Now that was the political environment at home, but in Vietnam, in fact, working with the military, the Marines in particular, we went under so many operations, covered so many dramatic events, and the Army. We were 99% welcome as reporters and photographers. Why? We shared their dangers. We were out in the kind of the 4 AP photographers that were killed, were out in the field with them. Of the 60-odd journalists who died, many of them in Vietnam, out with the soldiers. We got along with the soldiers in the field. And a lot of this so-called press war between the military and the media was launched really out of Washington, and as you heard, Lyndon Johnson's fulminations.
Bob, we're talking about the power of images. I think of the photography. I think photography is a little bit more apolitical than other media over there. When you have I'm a television guy, so with television there's got to be words, there's got to be pictures, and there's more editorial. There was something that was so clear about many of the images we saw there that I don't care what side of the political spectrum you were on, the image told the story. And so when you see a burning monk in 1964, 65, and you're hearing reports about the Diem government and whatever, and you start understanding that there is real conflict within the government of Vietnam. When you see the Marines wade ashore in Da Nang in 1965, I think that was the first time Americans really said, we're at war here now. This is a very large commitment of troops. And then when you see something like Tet, or you see the evacuation from the embassy in Saigon, these are indelible images that really said so much about the war, and I don't think you can put a political spin on that. Yes, maybe in the selection of the process of what photographs get in the newspaper, yes, there's maybe some bias there, but the pictures pretty much say what was going on, and I think they cut through a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the conflict between the media and the government.
And I'm going to sort of condense. A lot of the questions actually are very personal, and there's 3 or 4 questions about your own personal mental health, I'll call it, or post-traumatic stress, and how it affects you or has affected you. You've all been in, well, Mike, you're unique in this group that you were actually in the service. But I'll start with you, Mike. I mean, as a journalist, and maybe it's blended for you, how do you carry the emotion of what you do back into the world and your life today?
Someone was earlier saying about being focused on what you're doing. I think you're very focused when you're over there, and I thought probably the most terrifying moment for me was watching the video afterwards with my wife in the safety and comfort of the couch in my house. I was scared to death when I saw it, the night of the invasion or whatever. But when I was involved in it, I think I was so much focused on what I was trying to do and what I was trying to accomplish that I didn't think that much about it. Now, I'm sure it has had some lingering effects since then. But I think, as you were saying, Santiago, there's an experience level that once you've been in a few situations in a couple of wars, there is a pattern that kind of emerges, and that's kind of that's your game. That's what you're involved in.
Right, isn't one of the challenges that it's such a unique experience that how do you come home and really explain to anybody what you've done?
I think it's very challenging for journalists to re-enter normal life because when you're covering a conflict it's a very intense experience. As Winston Churchill famously said, there's nothing as exhilarating as being shot at without result. And so it's this intensity of experience combined with your own very strong belief and motivation as to why you're there. And it's an extraordinarily unique experience. And when you come back into sort of what you might call normal life, it's often very difficult to decompress. And when studies have been done about the effects of covering conflict on journalists, they have found that the frequency of either full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder or its component parts is on a par with the military and other first responders. And so traditionally in the world of journalism, the attitudes towards PTSD were very macho and very simplistic. In other words, the notion was that you solved your problems at the bar. And the idea of actually seeing somebody and exploring your attitudes to things was not understood or even accepted. I think in the last 15 or 20 years, those attitudes have begun to change. And news organizations, including the AP, now make a very focused and concerted effort to look after, or to try to look after, the mental health of their employees when they come back from particularly horrific experiences, and to help them process their experiences in a way that allows them to continue to live a healthy.
So you actually, you train and then deal with it with people who've been in the field when they come home?
Well, it's not so much that you train it, you put your people in contact with trauma experts who can help them disentangle their experiences when they come out. Now, it's clearly a fine line, because on the one hand, you have an obligation, in my view, as an employer, to look after your employees long after the conflicts are finished. On the other hand, the issue of mental health is such a personal and intimate issue that you need to walk that fine line and understand where the limits are, and set things up for people, but allow them to take control of their own condition.
Julie, you went earlier, I mean, you said it was pretty clear you wanted to go to the big story, but you also wanted to go to war. Were you ready emotionally?
Yeah, I think I'm one of those people who was probably ready emotionally for just about anything. As Mike said, you just you focus on what you're doing. And I've always been very good at doing that, ever since I was even just a little kid. I wanted to do the big story, and it turned from a story to a commitment while I was in Iraq in 2003. It was, there's always going to be that one moment, that defining day where something happens and you finally make that full connection of why you're there and what you're doing there and what your purpose is there as a journalist. And that did come for me in Iraq, doing casualty evacuation. That was one of my embeds while I was there, and helping a corpsman do CPR on a dying Marine. And from that point on, it wasn't just the story anymore. It was, I need to follow this. I need to be the eyes for the world. And that's why I wanted to do that, or at least continue doing that from then on. Was there a second part of your question?
No, but I'll ask one now. I mean, you famously took the picture of a Marine who was, at the instant he was hit by a sniper right there. Had you interacted with him before that? Did you know his name when he got shot? You had that picture. What were you thinking when you sent it back to New York?
No, I did not. I had never met Joshua Bernard formally. I'd seen him around the fire base. There were probably 400 other Marines in that little outpost for the first couple of days, because they had just assaulted the town. I'd seen him, never met him, didn't really know his name. And he was actually on point, and I saw him on point while we were on that patrol, and I was about maybe the third person back. There were a couple of guys who were even with each other just behind him, and I thought about going up closer to Bernard, but I thought, no, I don't want to interfere with what he's doing, and I don't want to be a distraction. I'm just going to stay back where I am. After that happened, after I photographed, that moment, as far as what I was thinking when I sent it back to New York, I waited until after the embargo was over. The embargo is you cannot release any names of casualties or send out any pictures until after next of kin has been notified. So I waited about 2 or 3 days, and until after the company commander actually came up to us and said, okay, embargo's lifted, you guys can publish names now. And that actually happened on a Friday. So I waited until Monday when the full crew on the desk was back and the desk manager was going to be there, because I wanted to make sure that someone in charge, someone with a lot of responsibility would be there to field that picture. I didn't want it just going out. I didn't want it to just accidentally, we get 1,000 pictures a day going out of on the wire just domestically alone. And I didn't want somebody who had been looking through too many pictures that day just to not think about what was happening. My thought was when I photographed it was, I have to do this. This is important. This is necessary. I don't know if we can even release it now. I don't know how this relates to the rules that we signed, but what's important is documenting this. This is history. This is part of history. This is the cost of war. And so when I sent that picture in, all of that was weighing on me. I have to discuss this with my managers back at the office. There needs to be, a debate about it. I didn't want this, to come quickly. There were a lot of factors involved.
Santiago, you were at the other end of that.
I'll just make a quick comment here.
Let me just, okay.
I think for a war reporter or a conflict reporter, there's a real calculation, the risk versus the professional reward. My career, I spent half of it with the AP, half with CNN. Now, both those news organizations covered the world. They had many other news companies and millions of viewers and those who were recipients of the information you were gathering, sort of dependent or very interested in what the reporters were doing. So in Vietnam, when I knew I went out with a Marine operation and was sharing the danger with the troops, that what I was occasionally photographing but always writing was reaching a huge audience that was not only in the United States, but an international audience, the subscribers of the AP. So that emboldened me, and I'm sure other AP reporters, to do probably more than you would if you didn't feel that there's many millions dependent on what you were doing. It also allowed certainly me to take the kind of calculated risk that others might not take. We have pictures in the book of the fall of Saigon where George Esper, Matt Frangiola, and I remained behind. Now the AP's first idea was to get everyone out of the bureau. We don't want to risk your lives in this situation. And it was dicey, and most journalists left with good reason. But Esper, Frangiola, and I talked about it, and we figured we'd covered the war for years. The risk was worth it to stay behind and write about the death throes of the South and the beginnings of the new Vietnam. And I had a similar calculation in Baghdad in 1991 when CNN was given the opportunity to cover the Iraqi side of the war, and most of my CNN colleagues, with good reason, decided that they didn't want to stay. But my calculation was, well, CNN was reaching at that point all around the world. We had 8 satellites in the sky, and we had equipment on the ground that we could cover live, first by voice, then very quickly by video. And that while the risks were great, the professional opportunity to actually cover a war, from that vantage point was unique, and I felt it was worth the risk of risking injury or even worse to do it. Just one other point, the post-traumatic stress is real. It happened to journalists in Vietnam. At least one committed suicide based on his experiences in Vietnam. But it was only really in the late 70s and the early 80s when the BBC and I think the AP and CNN started talking seriously about post-traumatic stress on its journalists and started conferring and trying to figure out how to handle that issue, be more considerate of photographers and reporters who expressed, expressed remorse or had difficulty serving in these action areas.
Okay, thank you. Santiago, just follow up on the decision-making in New York when that picture landed.
So this picture, there's a whole interesting story behind this picture that was quite controversial at the time, and probably still is, and with good reason, I would say. So this picture landed. The question was what to do with it. It's a picture showing a dying Marine, Lance Corporal Joshua Bernard, given his life for his country in Afghanistan. We had waited until his family had been notified, so we had followed the embed process up until that point. And the question was then what to do with this image. Do we spike this image so that it doesn't see the light of day, which was one option, or do we use this image as the centerpiece for a story about one man and his sacrifice for his country? Do we personalize a casualty in the war, which up until that point, we had not seen images like this. It was exceedingly rare to see an image of a dying or severely wounded U.S. servicemen in Afghanistan, or in Iraq for that matter. And so we had a very robust and interesting conversation in the newsroom about what to do. There were some people who argued that it was not becoming to show a photograph like this showing somebody dying. There were other people who said that it was absolutely necessary and that we had a duty to do it, and that our duty of telling the war extended to even difficult moments like this. And so what we decided to do in the end was to flesh the story out and do some additional reporting to try and understand and explain who this young Marine was. And we sent a reporter up to meet his family up in Maine, and we discovered that his father had been a career Marine, a sergeant, and we discovered details about him and his family. And as part of that process, we showed these pictures to his family informationally, telling them that we were going to publish them and write a story about their son. And they beseeched us not to do that. And so that went into the process as we continued to think about it and continue to debate it. We then contacted Julie to get her perspective and a detailed description of what happened, and she allowed us to use some quotations and some words from her own journal, which was putting this whole issue into context and describing what it was like to witness that and what it was like to photograph that. And in the end, what we decided to do was to go ahead, despite the objections of the family. And that was a very difficult decision, because you had the family asking us specifically not to, because they didn't think it was going to be constructive, and yet we had to weigh that against our journalistic responsibility to tell the public about one man's sacrifice for his country in a way that had really not been done before. And so we prepared the story, and all of this process took several weeks to get to. And as a courtesy to the Pentagon, a day or so before we released the package of images and text, we informed the Pentagon that we were going to do this. And that inspired then Secretary of Defense Gates to write a personal letter to the then AP President Tom Curley, imploring him not to publish the pictures. Gates then followed up with a phone call to Curley and made his case again. Curley consulted with the newsroom and got our views on it, and we said that we thought it was our journalistic duty to publish this image and to provide the additional context to honor this man's sacrifice. And Curley told Gates that he was very sorry, but that we were going to go ahead, at which point Gates made his objections public. We published. There was a lot of controversy. And then a couple of interesting things happened. Not very many newspapers in the United States ran the picture. They chose not to. A number of them ran the story of his sacrifice and who he was, but not many actually ran the picture. They shied away from it. But the reaction that we got from the military was quite interesting. At the highest levels, Secretary of Defense and people in the Pentagon, there were strenuous objections. But at the field level, many officers applauded our decision and agreed with it because they were concerned that nobody was telling the real story of what was going on. And to this day, you get divided opinions. You get many people with substantial combat and battle experience who will tell you that they agree with what we did, and that you will get other people who take into consideration the emotions of the family who will disagree with what we did. But we did it. We stand behind it, and the debate continues.
What was the reaction from the family after you published, one way or the other?
The reaction from the family was very negative. The father at that point was involved in a campaign to change the tactics on the ground and was lobbying the Pentagon through, I believe, his senator or maybe his congressman, I can't remember exactly, to get away from this tactic that was being employed in Afghanistan at that time, was essentially foot patrols, probing certain areas, looking for contact with the enemy, and it was costing a lot of casualties, and the father was very concerned about that. His reaction to us was one of contempt and disgust, predictably, and I must say I can't blame him for that. His son died, and we chose to tell the story.
I'd like to make one historical point here. I was researching the topic, and I noticed that in 1943, President Roosevelt lifted a ban on the publishing of pictures of dead American soldiers in World War II. Why did he do it? He sensed rising cynicism amongst the American public about the kind of information they were getting. No pictures of any dead Americans, very few of any wounded Americans. He lifted the ban, and Life magazine and others immediately started publishing pictures, including the June 6 invasion pictures, where pictures were published showing maggots on the bodies of Americans who had been there. So I think that the American public can handle the pictures of its own young men who go into combat. I'll just quote one story here quickly, that Horst Voss and I in January of 1966 covered a operation by the 1st Division, and were invited by a Colonel George Eister, who was a battalion commander. And so it was west of Saigon in an area riddled with tunnels and bush, and Horst was taking pictures, and I was standing with the colonel at one point looking at a map, and he was pointing out the course of the operation that day, and a company commander was beside him. A sniper popped out of a hole and fired 4 bullets. They went through the map and into the chest of Colonel Eister. And Horst ran up and got a dramatic picture of Eister bleeding and being bandaged, but clearly he was sallow and dying. So I wrote a story that day, but didn't mention it, but he did die a day later. And the policy then was to allow the publication of names and pictures of soldiers once the family had been notified. The family had been notified, so I did a story about this wonderful man I'd known. He was the son of a general in World War II, and talked about him and his friendship. And I got a letter. The Orlando Evening Star published the story from Eister's hometown. And a few weeks later, I received a letter from Harriet Eister, who was the wife of Eister, and she said many things, but she ended with this paragraph, quote, "You gave his children a legacy that no one else could have, for writing in such a manner that his courage and heroism will live for them and be an inspiration for them forever." Now, many stories were written by many journalists about heroic Americans in Vietnam. All the AP stories were published by local media, and I think reaction from the public was often positive to know how their men were dying and the way they were dying and what they believed they were dying for during that war.
Well, what you're all hearing really is from everybody sort of there's a mission here. Journalists are mission-driven people, and when you get a letter like that, where you think you can actually affect someone's life or have an impact, it gives you a reason to be there and maybe take some of the risks you're taking. But Mike, you wanted to say something, I think.
The unit I was with, the first sergeant, who was really in a Marine unit, is the straw that really stirs the drink, was the first man in our unit to be killed during the invasion. And it was a very difficult time for the troops because they idolized this man, and they all had previously thought they were invincible, and they saw the most invincible man in the unit get cut down. We had a very difficult decision to make because we had been embedded with this one unit for 3 months, and so when I would come on the air, people knew which unit I was with. And when we had to mention that we had taken some very serious casualties, it automatically struck me that the people at home were going to narrow it down to within 100 people, someone they might know. And this was before the notification process or whatever, so we had to be very, very careful. And we actually went to some pains to not report where we were. We expanded the unit to be a regiment, not a company. So we were actually putting out information to kind of disguise who might have been killed in that unit. And I think that's something we didn't understand, the military didn't understand with the embed process, that we were going to be so instantaneous with the reporting that we were going to be days ahead of any official notification. And that loomed very large on all of us. We all took the responsibility much more seriously at that point. And I think Julie made a point. You have a tendency to gauge the sentiments of the unit you're with in the situation. And even though we signed these contracts on the embed process of what was going to be allowed and not allowed, there was a lot of give and take between the officers we were assigned and the units we were assigned with and the situation. And something interesting happened after I came back from Iraq. The Pentagon gathered a bunch of embed reporters, and they brought back the officers from the field to do kind of a post-mortem of how it all worked. And to the absolute horror of the Department of Defense people who put together the embed process, they realized that none of the field officers had ever seen the contract that we had signed, what was allowed and was not allowed. And then they asked the reporters about the contract that we had signed, and we all said we didn't even read it. We knew it was non-negotiable. We knew we weren't going in unless we signed it. We just signed it. But we knew the broad strokes of it, about not giving away positions, not saying where we were going, troop strengths, not identifying a wounded soldier or a dying soldier. But an interesting thing happened out of that whole process. As they dug a little bit deeper, they discovered that the officer of the unit and the reporter generally worked together and came up with solutions to situations that seemed to be the right thing to do. And I think they were very amazed that, given the love-hate relationship between the media and the military, that we would be able to figure this thing out. And I think it became because we were so much apart, being with the units, understanding their situation, and they were understanding our situation, that we were able, the embed process, we were able to do this kind of give and take and hopefully do the right thing based on the situation. One case in point, the first morning after the invasion, a huge editorial story, we saw all these Iraqis trying to surrender and head south, which had huge editorial significance. We had signed in the agreement that we could not photograph prisoners. It would be violating the Geneva Convention, and we might be using them for propaganda purposes. These Iraqis were obviously very jubilant that the war was over. They were heading south. They could finally surrender to somebody. And I looked at the officer I was with, and we looked at the situation, and it was his suggestion that I go up the road. He said, they're not prisoners until they cross that bridge. And as long as you go on the other side of the bridge, you can take the pictures. And so I went across the bridge, we took the pictures, but in deference to the spirit of the agreement, we shot from behind their backs, not showing their face, whatever. My purpose of my story really is this, is that the embed process, I think, worked when there was respect, mutual respect between the military and the journalist, and they kind of made it up as they went. And I think with a number of embedded reporters, and the number of incidences and violations, security violations, it was relatively small. So in that regard, I think it did work.
So we probably have time for one more question, and please answer. I'm not going to direct it at anybody, but and this is also some of the questions. Is always the issue or the risk of a journalist being used and manipulated by whichever side you're on? And Santiago, you said a very interesting thing, that Julie's pictures really were unique because we hadn't seen many pictures out of many years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan of wounded or injured or dead Americans. There were horrific pictures that frequently only could be found on the internet of what American weapons or during the war had happened to Iraqi or Afghan civilians. How do you think about that, any of you, if you want to answer that, and you're on one side, how do you begin, how is it part of your role to tell the impact of the war on who the United States is fighting, who the victims are, or how do you assess that? Do you even think you want to get the other side when you're out there? Peter, in Vietnam, obviously that was a little complicated, but in these other wars, you know, I remember when I was in Beirut, I literally had passes that enabled me to move throughout Beirut, and I could go, I was told once by Marine snipers who were very upset with me that they'd see me with guys on the other side of the perimeter at the airport. And then the next day I was with them. So how do you deal with that? I mean, any of you, in your own experiences, do you have an obligation to tell both sides?
I think you absolutely do have an obligation to tell both sides. And one thing that concerns me is that sometimes we're criticized for that. And I think it's important to recognize that the embed process, while it's useful, is only the view from that side of the conflict. And so what we have always tried to do at the AP is tell the story from as many different sides as possible. And increasingly, we come to rely on local journalists to do that. And so nowadays, I would say maybe 95% of the journalists and photographers and videographers that we have working in the world are either from the countries or regions that they're covering. And that's not to say that we don't train them. We train them very carefully in terms of what our ethics are and what our standards are and what their job is. And one of the things that we train them to do is to remember that it's our job to inform, and it's not our job to shock people for the sake of shocking people. And so while many of the information, images, or other stories that come out of these stories are truly shocking, the point is that they have to tell the story, and the broader point is that the story needs to be as complete as possible, because we all know that there are many sides to stories, and that stories are not cut and dry, and the world is not black and white, and there are many shades of gray, and it's our job to tell the story as completely as possible. I think what has happened in the last 20 years or so has been that the flow of information around the world has speeded up incredibly, in large part due to the internet, if not entirely. And so the protagonists of the stories that we cover are much more attuned to the results of our work than they were ever before. It used to be the case that if you came across a militiaman on some deserted road manning a checkpoint, you could usually talk your way through it, make a few pictures, and that person would probably never see the results of your work. Or if they did, they might see it in a newspaper or magazine some days or weeks later. Nowadays, with the proliferation of internet cafes and mobile devices and cell phone networks and whatever it is, people are seeing the results of their work almost instantaneously. And one of the effects of that, I believe, has been to make the profession of journalism that much more dangerous, because people are seeing the results of your work. They realize that information is a very powerful thing, and they attempt to harness it by influencing it. And the influence is often carried out in a very violent and dangerous way that's very hazardous to the health and welfare of the journalists. And that is that journalists are increasingly targeted, murdered, kidnapped, beaten, detained. And it used to be that you would identify yourself as a journalist. That would be one of the first things that you would do on arriving in a conflict situation. You would put in big letters the letters TV on the side of your car, and maybe even carry a flag that said TV on it, and tell everybody who cared to look that you were a journalist. And as a result of the information flow at that time, I'm talking maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you enjoyed a certain amount of respect and neutrality. You were perceived to be a neutral party. Sometime in the 1990s, in the Balkan Wars, perhaps, that began to change as the internet began to develop and the flow of information began to move around. And now that's the last thing that you do, is identify yourself openly as a journalist, because chances are if you do that, somebody's going to try and kill you. So everything has changed and continues to change. But the goal of the work is the same, to tell the stories as completely and thoroughly as possible.
Peter, you want to?
Just to make a point, the tradition of balanced mainstream journalism in the United States is under attack now. We know that. Because you have certainly the internet, the blogosphere, and others are saying, well, all these reporters, they'll go and talk to a Republican here and a Democrat here, and they're just criticizing each other. And even in, say, a war in Baghdad in '91, where I was criticized for conveying information from Saddam Hussein and others, that was balanced by the numerous outlets in the US and Europe for comment contrary to what the Iraqis were saying. But now we hear that there should be more responsibilities for reporters to come to conclusions about what they're seeing. And I think I don't agree with that, because in the case of Vietnam, when we began in '62, there was a general agreement amongst all the young reporters that this was a war well worth fighting. It was America's new strike against the spread of communism, and it took years for some of us to start believing, well, maybe it's not working. It's not working. And to come to conclusions at any point about the value of that war for a mainstream journalist, I think would have been erroneous. I think the role of the media should have been, as Santiago was suggesting, to let information flow from as many sources as possible, leaving the public to make up mind. But just one point, I remember I'd get clippings sent from New York with my stories and other AP stories from Saigon. So in the top, some of the pages, you'd have a Lyndon Johnson press conference and his comments about the war. And at the bottom of the page, there'd be my analysis, say, of that same war. They were totally contrary viewpoints. And it was up really to the American public to try, or publishers, to figure out what was really happening in Vietnam. It was really difficult. And frankly, I was not prepared at any point to make a judgment the war was going badly or not going badly in terms of a larger context. I said, this week in this zone, there were reverses, or this zone, there were successes. What does this say about the big picture? Get someone else to say it.
Mike or
I think
Julie?
Santiago brings up a point. I think the most pressing issue now in war coverage is the source and the provenance of the material. One of the last tours I did in Iraq, I didn't really know where the photographs were coming. As the bureaus cut back, as the networks cut back, they were relying more on local stringers for material. And you didn't, you always heard how did the guy get the shot of that explosion? He must have known it was going to happen before it happened. So now, because of the internet and the speed of this, a picture gets published, or a piece of video gets out on some cell phone, and everybody has to have it, and they run with it. And I think that's probably the most difficult job now in the coverage, is finding out where did that picture come from? What was the source of that picture? Peter, in Vietnam days, it was all journalists from the networks and the wire services, whatever. You knew everybody, you knew the source of everything. Now you don't know where the material is coming from, and I think that leaves it wide open to some very difficult decisions that people like Santiago have to make, is, do we run this shot or not?
I think that's true, especially you look at the conflict going on in Syria right now, for example, and in the last 18 months or so, the rebel factions there have fractured and are fighting amongst themselves, and you're getting some very radical jihadist groups on the ground. And one of those groups has determined that their course of action is to kidnap as many journalists as possible. And estimates now say that there are about 18 Western journalists being held by these groups. There is no talk of ransom, there is no negotiation. These people are being held. In some cases, it's known where they're being held. In other cases, there's no information whatsoever. But what it has done is it has dissuaded almost all journalists from covering large areas of that conflict. And this is a conflict that's been going on for 3 years now, that's caused over 100,000 deaths, that has displaced millions of people, both internally and into neighboring countries. It's a very dramatic and important story because of the geopolitical relationship between many of the countries in the region, Iran, Russia, Israel, United States, Gulf states. It's an extraordinarily important story, yet the dangers have escalated to the point with the introduction of the kidnapping element, where independent journalism is either impossible or very, very hazardous. And so as a result, the Western media are relying on what we call user-generated content coming out of that. And much of that content is being gathered by people who clearly have an agenda. And so it's the job of the journalists and the journalistic organizations, absent the ability to witness these things themselves, is to take this information and investigate it and compare it and contrast it and give it the context that it's needed. And ultimately, if those organizations are comfortable and it meets their standards, to release it, with the argument being that some information is better than no information at all.
Yeah. Julie, you want to have the last word here?
Yeah, I'm just going to build on what Santi's saying about the safety of the journalists. I always found it as much as I enjoyed the embed process, because I had all this access to the troops and I could really, get into their lives out there, it was limiting because you were not able to cover the population, the locals, the people who were affected by the war itself. And as I was saying to Santi earlier, in places like in the Middle East especially, just culturally speaking, you have no access to 50% of the population, and that's the women. And there's a whole lot of information there that we just don't get because of that. And even when I did have access to some of the homes with the women, because I was a woman and I could go inside, I had no translator with me because all the translators were men. And they can't go in. They're not supposed to look at someone else's, wives or sisters, daughters. I found that to be very frustrating at times. So you end up having a story that is kind of one-sided. And I mean, if I had the opportunity to do an embed with the Taliban, would I do it? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm curious. I want to know what these guys are like when they're not shooting at us. Who they are, who their families are, what kind of lives they lead. Why do they think? Why do they feel like they need to fight for whatever it is that they're fighting for? Will those things be things we ever figure out? I don't know. Probably not. I mean, we kind of know to an extent, but we don't know it to the extent that we know our own people, like Americans or any NATO forces that we're embedded with. And I find that very unfortunate.
Well, this has been a fascinating evening, and the panel will be out in the lobby following this for reception. There was one question I didn't get to, but someone in the audience said they were a marine photographer in 1966 and 67, and they have their archives, and they want to know what to do with them. I would speak to Santiago or Mike. And the other thing I just want to say, the book is remarkable. You saw some of the pictures. I think it's a very important book. It really shows and takes you back to what many of you in this room and the Marines and the U.S. military experienced in Vietnam in a really gritty, very real way. One of the issues today is we're overwhelmed by the images, but those images really stand out. And people like the people on the panel, who I have a tremendous respect for, I'm a journalist as well, as you can hear, are really driven by their passion, believe they're on a mission, and they literally risk their lives to do the work to bring it out to the American public. So I think symbiotically there's a lot of important people in this room, and I want to thank you all for a terrific evening. And the book is out there.
Thank you.